it's Joseph. So, got some things to share with you today. I need to reorient you to the podcast, and part of this I really wanted to get right, so forgive me for reading from a bit of a script that I wrote, which I will use to make sure I don't miss anything and occasionally depart from. So if you're new here, welcome. This podcast will be pinned at the top as best I can, wherever it shows up. Certainly in Substack, I'll be able to pin it. If you've been listening for a long time, thank you for staying with the work. I really appreciate your audience. So this podcast was previously published under a different title, The Heart of Soul. And over time, the focus of the work clarified, and it became clear to me that the most honest name for what I'm doing here is now the Human Maturity Podcast. And I want this podcast to be about human development in the most literal sense, how people actually mature, how they grow up, the capacities they need to do that, what tends to get bypassed rather than matured, and what it takes to develop self-authority in contact with reality. When I use the word maturity, I don't mean moral superiority or spiritual attainment. I mean adulthood. The ability to think clearly, act deliberately, relate cleanly, and take responsibility for one's life without outsourcing authority or ignoring any aspect of reality. Earlier episodes remain part of the record. They reflect my thinking as it evolves, and I'm not disowning them. But if you're just arriving, you do not need to start at episode 1. This isn't a curriculum you have to move through in order anymore. It hasn't been for a while anyway. You're welcome to start wherever something catches your attention. There is one additional change I want to name explicitly. In the past, this podcast included almost exclusively regular conversations with Stace Barron, who was closely associated with Edenity, the paradigm of Edenity, of course. I'm no longer an Edenist for reasons I'll explain, and I feel sad as I say that, which surprises me a little bit. It's been quite a process for me, but I'm going to keep things in the structural domain as much as I can here, because that's the cleanest place to be right now. For the time being, Stace will not be a regular presence on this podcast, and the podcast is no longer oriented around Edenity as a paradigm. This change isn't about conflict or personal disagreement. It's about direction. Over time, it became clear that the questions I'm now working with, questions of development, self-authority, structure, and reality, require a different frame and a different level of precision than the Edenity model is designed to hold. It has been the most exquisite model for human existence that I know of, certainly that I've experienced. It has taken me so many amazing places, but I feel I've hit its limit. And rather than trying to stretch an existing paradigm beyond its limits, I've chosen to let this work stand on its own terms, the work I'll be developing heretofore. I'm deeply grateful for what earlier conversations made possible, and I'm not interested in collapsing anyone's work. This is simply a case of divergence. Edenity is a model. We've been talking about it, Stace and I, as a model for as long as this podcast has existed. And I dare to think that I found its limits, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So I'm building upon that to create another model, and that's just a tradition as old as time. You might even say that's an epistemological responsibility. So I recently completed a manuscript that generated a great deal of clarity around these issues, particularly around emotion-first models of development and spirituality. And I'll get into some detail about that. Writing this manuscript clarified what the work I want to do is, and what Edenity is and what it was not. The podcast going forward reflects that clarification. I will put the manuscript link in the show notes, and I invite everybody to read it. I want to apologize for its length, but that's how long it took. It's long. I'll say a little bit about when I get to the categorical error that is the basis of it, what it was like for me in a minute or two here, but I'm still plowing through my script to keep me on track. It's difficult. This is difficult. That's why I gave myself a script, because there's a lot I want to say. There's a lot I need to say. And there's some things that I'm purposely wanting to steer away from because it's not necessary. So I'm keeping myself on track here. So yeah, the manuscript is available if you want to go deeper, but it certainly isn't required to listen here. The podcast will stand on its own. And I'm not sure yet, but I'm pretty sure in the coming weeks and months, I'll be sort of pulling out pieces from the manuscript and sort of exploding them like you explode in a diagram, zooming in and talking about them to help tease some of the concepts out. But I'm almost said it's all there in the manuscript. All of the implications are not actually in there, but most of them are. There's nothing you're required to believe, agree with, or adopt. I'm not trying to recruit people to my new way of looking at things. If Edenity is working for you, that's great. And I'm just going to talk about the limits I see in the model that I think people should be aware of, and use that friction to propose some different ways of looking at things. If that's interesting to you, then keep listening. If not, then as I say at the end of every one of these episodes, then I wish you well on your journey. So my aim is to offer clear distinctions, clear distinctions, developmental context, and a language for capacities and dynamics many people feel but haven't had a way to name. Throat clearing aside, let me read that sentence again. My aim is to offer clear distinctions, developmental context, and language for capacities and dynamics many people feel but haven't had a way to name. I'm still figuring a lot of things out. I'm by no means done developing a new model. I'm just beginning. But what I have, I think, are some more solid philosophical premises, and I'm excited to see what's possible. Disagreement is welcome. Confusion is welcome. What I'm not interested in is bypass, emotional, spiritual, or otherwise. I'm assuming that my listeners are capable adults, able to think for themselves and decide what's useful. If this makes you angry and you want to express that rage at me and you are an Edenist, I would remind you that your own paradigm says that's unhealthy. And I would add unproductive. So I'm going to stay in the author of a manuscript role here for a while, because that's just the cleanest. There are a lot of domains at work here. I'm a former student of Edenity. I'm a former facilitator in Edenity. I have personal relationships with people in Edenity. There's a lot of different domains, and we know what happens when we try to juggle a lot of domains at once. It tends to get unproductive, messy, unnecessarily, problematic. So I'm going to stay in the role of being the author of a paper, and we'll go from there. So if you're here for Edenity-focused material, earlier episodes are still available. I thought about that a lot. At the moment, it seems like leaving them there makes sense. There's a lot of great stuff there, and I think it will be useful going forward to talk about what I think can persist and what doesn't make sense anymore. If you're here for work oriented toward human maturity, development, self-authority, and reality, you're in the right place. I wrote this in my manuscript, but I want to say it here again. I'm hugely grateful for all the ways I've grown with the help of Stace and Bree, the founders of Edenity. I recall that when Stace told his Zen master, I believe his name was Hapsu in Portland, Oregon. He told his Zen master that he saw the architecture of the emotional body, and his teacher said, well, you're either not enlightened and still hung up in duality, or you're seeing something new. And Stace would say that was the integrity of pure Zen and not rushing to a position. I'd like to invite you to give me that same latitude. Maybe my identity work is hung up and my departure from the paradigm is defensive in nature, or maybe I'm seeing something new. You're welcome to think whatever you want about that. I'm just going to tell you what I see after testing the premises of identity for over 2 decades. So, with all of that orientation in place, let's begin. One quick housekeeping note. I'm going to republish the 6 Yin and Service podcasts that I took down because, as you'll understand at some point, the real reason that they upset people is because it threatened one of the fundamental premises of the paradigm. And that's talked about. There's a whole chapter on the Yin and Service document that I released last spring, in the spring of 2025. There's a section in the manuscript about that. Okay, so I had no intention of this happening. So in many ways, I'm as surprised, maybe even more, than you are, or than you might be. I was not looking for problems in identity. I was not thinking there were any problems in identity. I was not experiencing that there were any problems in identity. I'll tell you exactly what happened. At the risk of being judged, but I care about the truth a lot, and this is the truth. I was working something out with ChatGPT. I was in a conversation with it, and GPT and I don't remember if I said this before, I had some very critical ideas about AI, and I still am concerned about what it will do to the general intelligence of people who grow up with it. But one thing I learned is, because it's an LLM, a large language model, it doesn't just excel at pattern recognition and extrapolation. It basically is pattern recognition and extrapolation. So I want to say I was able to train it, and there's some ways in which I was able to train it, but mostly the way I trained it was by showing it that I want the truth. I don't need things soft pedaled, and I'm capable of digesting serious metaphysical exposition. And I talked with ChatGPT quite a lot about this, trying to understand how it worked. And I'd had some experience where other people I knew were asking the same questions and getting different answers, and I wanted to understand why they were getting different answers. And basically, it extrapolates, and here's a hint, it's a garbage in, garbage out kind of phenomenon. It extrapolates from what you ask it how and what to answer. And it explicitly at one point told me that it will not act as an authority. So it will only challenge your point of view so much, and that's why it can't substitute, yet anyway, for a facilitator, a therapist, teacher, someone who is going to hold you accountable. AI will not hold you accountable in any kind of steep way. But in my own self-interest, I trained it to go as far in that direction as I could get it to do. So here's what happened. That's sort of a sidebar for your edification about using AI. The more precise you are with it, the more precise it will be with you. So I was working something out with it. And at one point, I said it had to do with an edgy conversation that I had had. And I was sort of mocking the debate and saying, well, this person said this and I said this, and what do you think? And there were some subtleties there, and I was trying to work it out. And at one point, I don't remember exactly what the context was. At one point I said, well, then they would just say to that, to what GPT said or whatever, they would say, well, we're emotional beings first and mental and energetic second, so therefore, etc. And I remember exactly how I felt when what happened next, it disagreed with me. And it said that idea is a categorical error. After a couple back and forths, it was saying, well, like I don't remember exactly what it said, but it challenged me on the idea. And I was advocating for the Edenity point of view. And I made my argument. I said, well, we process reality emotionally first. This is well demonstrated and documented in the world of advertising, and it's how marketing gets created. And babies are born basically without much mental capacity at all, and then they, they're pure emotion, and they develop the mental capacity later. And all of the arguments that have been delivered on this podcast and in Barron's brilliant work, there's no such thing as a negative emotion. You guys know that argument, or at least I hope you do, because it's an important argument to be able to make, because you should know both sides. So I made the argument to GPT, and it wasn't having it. And it was accusing me of making, in philosophy, what's called a categorical error. Now, we don't talk much about categorical errors in Edenity. Domain contamination is a kind of categorical error, but it's when you apply what is true to one category, you misapply it in another category. And so basically, GPT was saying, well, just because you developmentally are emotion first as human beings and then develop mind second, or very often have an emotional reaction to stimuli and then have the thought second, doesn't necessarily mean that human beings are structurally emotion first and mind second. So take that in for a second, because it's important to get the distinction, because in the realm of Edenity, we often would shorthand it as we're emotion first or emotion first. And it's important to expand that, because when we say we're emotion first, as Stace and I have said so many times, it collapses the structure and the processing sequence. Not on purpose, but it's just that needs to be explicated now, because I'm disambiguating the two concepts. So Stace has said very often, and I often mix these two up, I'll just say it however it comes out and fix it after. Ontology follows ontogeny. Well, you can kind of make it work either way. So ontology is the structure of reality. In this case, it literally means, in philosophy, it's the study of being, the study of reality, the study of the structure of reality. For Edenity, we're talking about the structure of the soul. Okay, so when Stace would say ontogeny follows ontology, and like I said, you can make it work either way. The idea is that ontogeny, when you hear the GEN in that, think Genesis, beginning, development. So the ontogeny of human beings is, and there's another clue or piece of evidence that Edenity has used related to this, is the answer to the important question of why boys have nipples. Funny question. Now, interestingly, a lot of people don't know the answer. The answer is because biologically we all start out as girls, and then about half of us turn into boys. So the ontogeny, the development of a human being, the being level development, I guess is what ontogeny is in that sense, does suggest yin first, that yin is somehow the substrate of being. And in the same way that babies are more or less pure emotion and then develop mind later on, that is also ontogeny or ontogenical. I'm making that up in the moment. The ontogeny is said to, by Stace, to follow the ontology. So in other words, because we all start out as girls, because we all start out with emotion, develop mind later, because we seem to very often have emotional responses to our environment before we have mental responses. Those are all ontogenical. I'm making, again, that word up. Those are developmental. That it's conclusive, Edenity says, that, or at least something reasonable to test, that we are structurally, ontologically, emotional beings first. That is to say, we are structurally emotional beings first. That's the foundation. That's the concrete. And the studs and the plywood and on the drywall, that's mental and energetic. So that's the key difference. So again, just so I don't, one more pass. Edenity says because of the ontogeny, it implies, from that we can infer the ontology, the structure. And that is the first premise of the 13 premises in There's No Such Thing as a Negative Emotion. And so it's the fundamental premise in personhood that is the basis of emotive body ensoulment. And of the 3 premises in Edenity, it's one of those 3 as well. Let's see if I can remember those. That we're structurally emotional beings first, emotive, more specifically. That we're structurally emotive first. That the self is sacred of and to itself, and that we're responsible for the contents of our unconscious. All of Edenity is based on those 3 pillars. And I'm suggesting that the first one is wrong. And it wasn't my idea. So back to the story. So while this was happening, while I was talking with GPT about this and debating the philosophical premise with GPT, I noticed I was starting to feel kind of disoriented. And I know it was cognitive dissonance. And I know that feeling well enough, having done a lot of work on myself, psychological, spiritual, etc. I know what it feels like when I'm losing an idea that hasn't been true. It was disorienting, vaguely nauseating, and I said that to GPT, and it actually said, "You're feeling that because you're deconditioning right now." And I didn't know what to think, but I was in the middle of like brushing my teeth or something, so I went to sleep and I woke up the next morning, and for about 2 weeks, a tide of ramifications and information came to me that were downstream of this question: what if it's not true? What if we're not emotive beings first? What if the ontogeny does not actually suggest the ontology? What if those are actually separate categories and we don't need to make the structure of the soul emotion first to be able to explain the phenomena of emotional reactions and baby development and all that? So that's what I mean when I say I wasn't looking for this, and it was quite disorienting, and sometimes still is. This happened in first half of December. So like I said, I went to work kind of in service to what was coming to me, and ended up writing quite a lot about it. So that's where I'm getting near the end, maybe 5 or 10 more minutes. I guess what I want to say is I don't want you to agree with it or disagree with it right away. And that's just good mental hygiene. the argument that I write in the manuscript is an exploration of what negative phenomena would be explained by the mistake, and what limits that I've perceived in the paradigm would be explained by that mistake. What have been the costs? And there are many. It became like a string that, like, when you pull on a piece of clothing, it like unraveled a lot. So I want to say a little bit about the developmental costs. I don't want to spoil the manuscript. And before I forget, read it slowly. If you choose to read it slowly. If you need help unpacking it's not really dense philosophy, I don't think, but sometimes it is. It is metaphysics, and metaphysics is dense by nature. Cut and paste stuff into GPT. Have conversations with it. It can meet you there, I promise. And I got a lot of help from GPT writing it. Otherwise, I would not have been able to write this many pages this fast. I did a lot of dictation and got it to extrapolate and turn my words into proper prose, which was an amazing learning experience for me. But please make no mistake, the argument is mine. The challenge of the premise was not my idea. And I'm actually glad to own that in a way. It's just true. I wasn't looking for this. This was not some, vengeance thing because I had a disagreement with Stace. It's not about that. It's about seeing a metaphysical emperor, a premise, a philosophical emperor, a premise that wore no clothes. And suddenly everything became so clear, I just couldn't look away. So I think one more thing I want to say before we close here. The reason the idea that we're emotive beings first is so compelling emotionally, because I think that's the first reaction, when you get, if you're listening to somebody do a talk or one of the podcasts or whatever, in the beginning, it might challenge some people's existing views that their, mind is primary or whatever. I mean, that's mostly the societal idea, and I don't hold that. The reason the primacy of emotion as structure, I think, is so compelling is because it's surely true that of the 7 developmental lines that I define, I'll list those in a moment, it's the most neglected one. And Edenity has that exactly right. Emotion has been systematically repressed for thousands of years. And as we say so often, psychology is only about 120 years old. It's of the developmental lines, it's last on the scene. But to make it structurally primary, I'm holding that now as a penduluming, an overstocking in emotion, an overcorrection, which is what we humans tend to do. And I would say a necessary one, a reasonable thing to test. The idea that we're emotive beings first structurally, you'll hear me say that, adding the structurally a lot rather than just saying emotional beings first, because first how? Structurally or processorally? We have to make that distinction now, to be careful, or I do. The reason it's so compelling is because it validates these repressed emotions that go way, way, way back, at least to our early childhood. So the the beginning of EBE is so compelling. It's like, oh, all of my feelings are valid. I don't have to hide this anymore. I can just be me. And that's really, really important. But it can be overdone. And in particular, I'll give you this framework. Because if you test, well, let me back up. It was a completely reasonable idea to test. Again, because of ontogeny, it made sense from a scientific perspective, as Stace did, to create a model to test what happens if we start with the assumption that we're emotive beings first. Completely reasonable thing to test. And I'm so glad we did it. Because now I feel I have, and I think that I have a seat to sit on where I can say, yeah, I tested that model and I reached what I think is a dead end. So if you picture the three hoods for a moment, personhood, sagehood, and sainthood, the assumption is that if we're emotive beings first and will and mind are downstream structurally of emotivity, the implicit assumption in the structure of the work and the curriculum, so to speak, is that if you clean up your emotivity, the deepest aspects of soul, Edenity says, then your mind and will develop as downstream derivatives of that, right? The same way if you clean the water upstream at the power plant or whatever, where the pollution is coming from, then the downstream water will result in getting clean. And it doesn't make sense to work on the downstream water. That's just a basic problem-solving concept, root cause analysis, right? You don't take apart your toaster if it turns out it's not plugged in, right? You find the root cause. So the root cause is at the emotive level for Edenity. And that's true in personhood. There is no formal development of will or mind in personhood. In sagehood, which is in Edenity, it's mental body ensoulment. The mental body curriculum and the ensoulment thereof of mind is the disidentification of mind, which results in Edenity's version of Zen enlightenment. That's an undoing of mind. It's not creating tighter boxes with mind. It doesn't develop mind. It has related impact on the way the mind works, and it certainly can improve the way the mind works, but that's not the intention. The intention is to disidentify from it, not to reinforce it or develop it. And in the third hood, in sainthood, which is the domain of will, that's WBE, willful body ensoulment. But the development of will in sainthood is through the surrender of life outcomes, surrender of your personal will to divine will. So it's the same thing as in sagehood. Your personal will is supposed to develop as a result of making room for divine will. So that's the picture of Edenity's treatment of mind and will from a high-level paradigmatic perspective. So what I'm asserting is that the experiment, that if you just do enough emotive maturation, enough disidentification from mind, and enough surrender of personal will to divine will, then your personal mind and your personal will derivatively develop on their own. I don't agree. I don't think it works that way. It's not been my experience in 20 years of testing. There have been some subtle downstream effects, but for those of you who've been listening to the podcast over the last couple of years, you've heard me talk about some of the loss of mental and willful capacities that I've been experiencing and the way that's been framed by the work, including by myself, is that those are artifacts of successful work. In other words, when Edenity is working well, the willful exhaustion, the fuzzy head, the loss of functionality is proof that it's working. And the tricky thing about that is it can be. I'm not saying this is black and white. It can be. And sometimes, maybe even often is. But what I'm asserting is sometimes it's not. What I'm asserting is if it's not true that we're emotive beings structurally first, and there is no curriculum for developing, no process for developing mind and will, then what happens is mind and will and structure get weak. And let me define the 7 developmental lines that I've identified, or name them anyway. And this is in the manuscript. Pretty much everything I've said is in the manuscript, one place or another. The 7 developmental lines that I'm working with now are emotion, relationality, intuition. Those are the 3 lines that are addressed by Edenity. And 4 more that are not. Mind, will, the body, and structure. 7 developmental lines. So what I'm asserting is that there is no hierarchical structure in the soul. I'm not even sure if I want to use the word soul. I'm orienting toward what can be directly experienced. And what I think can be directly experienced, what I think I have directly experienced is if you put emotion as structurally primary, it creates, and it depends on the individual and where they are in their life, it can serve them immensely. Again, like I said, because emotion is so underdeveloped and stigmatized in our society, there's a functionality to putting it primary for a while, for some people, and at some stages of development. The cost, however, though, is over time, it weakens people's structural lines, willful lines, and mental lines in ways that renders them dysfunctional, indulgent, irrational, unable to take care of themselves, unable to reason. And that's where the yin and service came in. So it produces yin and service results, if you're familiar with that. And part of I wrote this in the manuscript. My mistake was I saw the symptoms before I saw the root cause. The root cause is what I'm calling the yin as essence fallacy. YAE, the yin as essence fallacy. So I've already talked about twice as long as I thought I was going to, so I think I'm going to wrap up here. Just looking to see if there's any loose ends. Don't try to take this in all at once. I wrote about 180 pages in 2 weeks when this first came to me. The manuscript is around 215 now. And it, like I said, it came to me like a tide, and it was a very intense time. So it probably doesn't have to happen that fast for you if you choose to engage with it. But take your time. Really think and feel your way through this. Use both faculties, because if we're not emotional beings first, structurally, and Edenity is a paradigm based around that assumption, there are a whole lot of downstream assumptions that were based on what I'm asserting was a foundation made of sand, unfortunately. I think that the emotional work, intuitive work, and the relational work of Edenity still has a lot of merit. It just doesn't get to be structurally primary to the other lines. And that changes some important things. And I'm still sorting all that out. So I think we'll leave it here. One last thing. If you have questions for me about this, I'm holding a boundary. And that is, I don't want to answer any questions from people until and unless they've read the entire manuscript. And that's just a preservation of my own energy. And it's the demonstration of a healthy, willful boundary, which Edenity did not recognize. I put a lot of work into this. It's extremely thorough, and my time is very valuable. I don't want to have to make this argument in real time. I'm not interested in debating it. That's why I wrote it down. So I'm not going to litigate it in real time. I'm not going to try to convince people. It's all right there. If after reading it, after reading the whole thing, you have sincere questions, I'm happy to answer that. And we'll probably be doing that in Second Sunday. We'll see what the response is and go from there. So one more thing, or just in closing, thanks again to Stace and Bree for creating this paradigm. I do not know who I would be without it. I have no idea. I can't even conceive of that. And it's also true that who I see, feel, and think I'm becoming requires something bigger. Thank you all for listening to the podcast up to this point. If I lose you as a listener, I understand. If Edenity is working for you, I understand. I just think you should be aware of a possible critique that I think has merit. Thanks for listening. Wish you well in your journey.